Anyway, I welcome you to the writing program's final event of the year, and we're delighted to have with us today Patricia Bizzell, whose work I have long admired, and I know many people in this room have as well. Pat is professor of English at the College of Holy Cross, where she founded and directed the Writers' Workshop and Writing Across the Curriculum program. At Holy Cross, she also directed the College Honors Program, the English Department, served as Speaker of the faculty, and so on. But her leadership roles have extended well beyond that campus. She's a past president of the Rhetoric Society of America and past president of the Alliance of Rhetoric Societies. She serves currently on the advisory board of Voices of Democracy, the U.S. Oratory Project, which is a website that has lots of cool stuff funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And last year, she received the Exemplar Award from the Conference on College Composition and Communication, which we were joking earlier is the Lifetime Achievement but Not Quite Dead Yet Award. And, anyway, a very prestigious honor and well-deserved. Her current research links religion and rhetoric in various ways, including some recent work on Jewish rhetoric. And this morning, a group of us were delighted to get to spend an hour and a half with Pat talking about an article that she'll be publishing in College English this fall on Spinoza, his rhetoric, rationalism, whether there's a particularly Jewish rhetoric quality to it or not. Well, what else? Well, by the numbers, she's published 6 books of various kinds, including a book that you'll either remember from graduate school as a teacher or a scholar of the rhetorical tradition. She's also published at least 3 dozen articles. I didn't bother to count them, but they're like this long. In journals including 3Cs, Philosophy and Rhetoric, Rhetoric Society Quarterly, Journal of Basic Writing, Journal of Advanced Composition, College English, and so on. And I thought I'd just give you a flavor by reading a scattering of titles of the breadth of her work. Academic Discourse and Critical Consciousness, Religion and Rhetoric, Reason, Emotion, and the Sensory in Religious Persuasion, Rationality as Rhetorical Strategy at the Barcelona Disputation 1263, a Cautionary Tale, Frances Willard, Phoebe Palmer, and the Ethos of the Methodist Woman Preacher, Native American Jeremiah, the Mixed Blood Rhetoric of William Appice. Did I get that name right? Feminist Methods of Research in the History of Rhetoric, Contact Zones in English Studies, Foundation and Anti-Foundationalism in Composition Studies. And I could go on, but you can hear some of the sweep there. One of the things I'll note beyond that is that these works are well anthologized, which is a true sign of their impact in the profession. Victor Villanueva's Crosstalk in Composition, for example, reprints not less than 3 of them, which I think is more than anybody else in there.
But who's counting?
Yeah, that's why I said not less than. There could be more. In a couple of professional projects that I've had the good fortune to work with Pat on, I've seen that the same sharp mind that allows her to produce these brilliant articles also allows her to query reluctant deans and to author precise recommendations.
Yeah.
I've also learned last night that she seemed to have liked the current Star Trek movie almost as much as I did. And further, that she nearly has the original 3 Star Wars movies committed to memory. That is, the ones before the Jar Jar Binks debacle. So somebody who, in addition to all of those qualities, also like Star Trek and Star Wars, what more could we want in more of the profession? Patricia Bizzell.
Doug, thank you so much for that very, very generous introduction. I'm going to read a paper because that's what people do on occasions like this. But please feel free to interrupt at any time if you want me to repeat something, you have a question, a comment, and we will, I think, have a lot of time at the end for further questions and discussion both here and at the reception that's laid out there in the back room. So to begin, Stanley Fish has a new book out entitled Save the World on Your Own Time. And as usual, any new publication by him is attracting a lot of attention. I was asked to comment on the book at a panel during the 2008 Modern Language Association conference, a panel, by the way, which I shared with Jonathan Culler, Judith Butler, and Stanley Fish. Talk about angels rushing in, fools rushing in where angels fear to tread. And I had to gather my courage before I could try to score on someone as quick as Stanley Fish. I've admired his work and indeed been shaped by it for a very long time. He once said something very nice about my work, but unfortunately in his new book he also says that composition studies presents the clearest example of what's desperately wrong with the academy. Because in writing classrooms, he says, quote, more often than not, anthologies of provocative readings take center stage and the actual teaching of writing is shunted to the sidelines, end quote. Therefore, I ventured at MLA to defend my field and to see whether I could block a few of his shots, and I expand here on these remarks. And a version of this essay will actually be published as an opinion piece in College English sometime in the fall. Not exactly like this, and I'll explain the difference in a minute. Now, to be sure, Fish's title exemplifies the logical fallacy of the straw man. Wishing to argue against those academics who claim, or at least seem to desire, that their work as teachers will foster social justice, Fish characterizes them as making a much larger claim that their work will save the world. Alas, it's pretty easy to demonstrate that no one's work is saving the world these days, but as the rabbinic saying has it, if we are not privileged to complete the task, neither are we allowed to desist from it. Certainly, composition studies hasn't been privileged to save the world. I admit that my title is somewhat tendentious and provocative, but nevertheless, composition studies, I think, has attempted to make the world a better place. And we've even been willing to engage in self-criticism about our ability to accomplish this task. Among influential treatments of this theme have been Maxine Hairston's Diversity, Ideology, and Teaching Writing in 1992, Richard Miller's book As If Learning Mattered, published in 1998, Kurt Spellmeyer's book Arts of Living, published in 2003. I could go on, and it will be seen that these works, which are unacknowledged by Fish, predate his book considerably. Indeed, I will suggest that some caveats were raised even in my own academic discourse and critical consciousness, which Doug mentioned. But in the face of Fish's wholesale condemnation, I'd like to explore here whatever resources we have for defending ourselves against such charges, testing the field against the critique Fish sets up in his new book. And now the essay will have two parts. The first part is sort of the revisionary history of composition studies, trying to substantiate my claim that it has in some small way made the world a better place. And then the second part of the essay summarizes Fish's argument in his book and tries to engage that argument. So this is the first part. Once upon a time, I actually had the nerve to teach a seminar at Holy Cross entitled Composition Studies and Social Justice. Where did I get the idea that my field had anything to contribute to social justice? Where, that is, beyond my own annoyingly patronizing, can I help you, liberal individualism? To address this question, we need to take a trip back in time. Let's review the work from earlier decades of scholars, whose names will be well known to specialists in rhetoric and composition, and who, I contend, established the social justice agenda of our field. The work I will be looking at will certainly not comprise every issue that has been developed in the field over the last 30 years. Rather, I will focus on the scholarship most interested in how personal, social, and cultural elements affect people's relationships with discourses, in short, the type of work most likely to offend Fish, as I will explain below. In a broad overview of the kind I propose to undertake here, I won't be able to discuss any one in detail, but you will find examples of their important work in the essay's bibliography. And I hope it will also be understood that the scholars I cite here have gone on to do additional, more recent work and have been joined by a whole new generation of productive scholars. I could have mentioned many more names and titles, but my project here is primarily archival, and I suppose it hardly needs mentioning, reflective of my own academic tastes. Okay, now there's a little sidebar before I go on to the rest of this essay. What I'm about to do is give you this revisionary history, naming the names of scholars that I see as representative of these different trends. In my dialogue with College English editor John Schilb, I first submitted a version of this essay that did not name any names, because I didn't want to name any names, because I knew if I did that, once the essay was published, people would immediately say, why didn't you mention so-and-so, like especially me, and why did you mention this other person? That was just asking for trouble to start naming names. So I didn't want to do that. So Schilb sent the essay out for review, and one of the reviewers wrote back and said, what's the matter with this woman? She doesn't cite any scholarship. And she only cites a few titles, and they're from 30 years ago. Right? So okay. So it's all right, I'll give you a version of the essay that does have all the names in it, and you decide which one you like better. So this is the version with the names, because I thought maybe you'd be interested to hear what names I would have mentioned, but John, after considering both versions of the essay, decided that I was right and that it would be better not to publish the one with the names. So you'll hear the names, but they won't be in college English. Okay, so trip back in time, let's start around 1980. This was the time when the contemporary field of composition studies really started to coalesce and grow. Its development was sparked by the changing demographics of the college classroom, bringing more and more students who seemed to have unusual difficulties writing standard English and shaping academic arguments. Perhaps in the past, teachers had simply established certain levels of writing and thinking ability that students were expected to meet and flunked out the dullards who could not meet them. But this approach seems self-defeating when, in the face of our new classroom populations, it might require us to send half of them home by Thanksgiving break. Composition teachers just didn't want to do that. Were we bent on saving the world? I don't really think so, just on doing our job, which was to teach writing, but we realized that we needed new ways to do that to address the new students' needs. In cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics, where we turned first for help, were misread to diagnose these struggling students as mentally retarded, arrested in what Piaget and Vygotsky called the egocentric stage of cognitive development, also known as dualism in William Perry's scheme. And some of these students, scholars claimed, were further handicapped by speaking a native language, Black English, that was structurally inferior to Standard English and actually contributed, therefore, to their cognitive delays. And so-called interference from native languages other than English also came in for some blame. And an elaborate cognitive process theory of writing was put forward to remediate these students. Now, you will notice that I haven't attached any names to any of these early approaches because I didn't want to embarrass anybody. They're now thoroughly outmoded and mostly rejected by their former proponents. I was a brand new teacher when I was reading this work, and it just didn't make sense to me. Teaching first-year writing at a big state university, I had plenty of students who had trouble with standard English and academic argument, but they did not seem to be impaired in any way, cognitively speaking. They struck me as extremely bright and unusually mature and sophisticated for traditional college-age first-year students. They just had trouble doing college writing. Perhaps the first major book that broke this logjam for me and for many other writing teachers in those days was Mina Shaughnessy's 1977 book, Errors and Expectations. Essentially, what Shaughnessy does in this book is bring new critical close reading skills to bear on the most impenetrable and error-ridden prose of struggling college writers, and in so doing, she makes sense of it thusly. She shows how many of their errors, from the sentence level on up to the level of overall argumentation, stem from their attempts to imitate a type of prose with which they have had little or to no prior acquaintance, what we've come to call academic discourse, and to claim its authority for themselves. Therefore, she argues these students should not be thought of as cognitively delayed or in need of remediation, but rather as beginners, writing at a very basic level from which we could hope that instruction would advance them. Basic writers, she called them. Shaughnessy's insights launched a whole fleet of scholars into research on what we came to call the academic discourse community. I'm proud to have sailed in this fleet with Ken Bruffy, David Bartholomew, Mike Rose, Marilyn Cooper, Tom Fox, and Joe Harris, to name a few of the most influential on me, and I don't think anyone needs to be embarrassed to be in this company, in spite of problems with the work that I will mention shortly. As writing instructors, we came to see our task as initiating students into this academic discourse community, helping them learn its ways of writing and speaking and winning arguments. Arguably, these theoretical developments led to improved pedagogies for teaching clear writing and cogent argument in ways that respected the students' intelligence and so encouraged their best efforts, as opposed to discouraging them with disparaging labels of deficiency. Did we save the world? I guess not, but arguably we made the world of the classroom a better place for basic writers. It was just dumb luck that about the time I was wrestling with these ideas, my then husband, Bruce Herzberg, won a postdoc to the School of Criticism and Theory, and he studied there with none other than Stanley Fish. I went along to UC Irvine that summer, we were actually on our honeymoon, and read everything Bruce read. Talk about a busman's honeymoon, it's really so cliched, it's unbelievable. So I read everything Bruce read, and I hated it. I argued vigorously against everything he was reading, against Fish's reader response criticism. I claimed the texts limited the readings that could be produced from them, if not to a single reading, at least to a range. I said social conventions constrain individuals but don't determine them completely. I never gave up my positions, but yet by the end of the summer I found that I had been converted to the view that discourse was constitutive, and Fish's concept of interpretive community was tremendously influential on me in developing my own idea of discourse community, and I think it helped my pedagogy. I did mention, though, that there were problems with early work in academic discourse, and I began to get some sense of what they would be from the other book that was profoundly influential on my own thinking back in those days, namely Brazilian literacy educator Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which appeared in English translation in 1968. Frere's project is to teach basic literacy to illiterate South American peasants, which, it will be immediately apparent, is at some remove from the task of teaching academic discourse to fully literate American college students, although I tended to elide important differences here, and once, heaven forgive me, I actually wrote these words, quote, "Basic writers are very like Frere's peasants," end quote. Well, no they weren't, but Frere's ideas did suggest an important insight, that basic writers' initial unfamiliarity with academic writing could be understood in terms of their group memberships, with some groups experiencing social disenfranchisements and exclusions that had kept them from encountering much academic writing in the past. It was no accident, given the deep strains of American racism, that students of color were disproportionately represented among basic writers, or given pervasive American sexism and homophobia, that many straight women and gay people of all races experienced more discomfort than straight men in adapting to academic agonism. Writing teachers were helped to understand the challenges faced by basic writers from various ethnic and cultural groups and sexual orientations through the work of Dale Bowers, Susan Jarrett, Elizabeth Flynn, Keith Gilliard, Min-Chan Liu, Harriet Malinowitz, and Victor Villanueva, to name the most influential in my own work. Thanks to Jeff Sirk, John Trimber, and others, we even began to get a sense of how social class played into the mix. Deb Brandt, Beth Daniel, and others helped us to understand how basic literacy acquisition, somewhere in the background of every student we teach, may impact his or her interactions with academic discourse, and native speakers of languages other than English have met with better composition pedagogy thanks to the work of Ruth Spack, Vivian Zammel, Helen Fox, Paul K. Matsuda, and others. I think the work of these people helped to improve composition pedagogy and make the classroom a more productive place for people of both genders and various races, ethnicities, and sexual orientations and social locations. If you believe that the inequities induced by racism, sexism, and economic exploitation should be ameliorated, then I think you would have to agree that this composition research, while perhaps not saving the world, did indeed contribute to making it a better place. At any rate, it was and is our job as writing teachers to teach all comers if we can, and this work certainly helped us to do that better. But I want to be a little more precise about what the field learned from these scholars. At first, it seemed that the gain would be in understanding the diverse discourse communities from which our students were coming so that we could better tailor our initiation activities, that is, better devise pedagogies that eased their transition into traditional academic ways of thinking and writing. It soon became apparent, however, that this notion of the necessary project was quite inadequate. It imagined a process that worked all one way, changing all comers into little clones of the traditional, skeptical, agonistic, and gender and race-neutral academic, what I came to see as the brain in a jar. But we were not working with blank slates on which we could inscribe whatever discursive conventions we favored. We were working with people who brought their own rich discursive resources to the academy, who did not want to give up their own ways of thinking and using language in order to succeed in the academy, and who found indeed that they brought resources that could address academic problems in ways not available to traditional academic discourse. Teachers and students alike found that what was needed was not a one-way acculturation process, but a two-way, indeed a multi-directional process of collaboration and change, whereby new forms of discourse were incorporated into academic ways of doing things, and new types of intellectual work were thereby enabled. The academy was enriched, and the students experienced more success as they moved through it. We now see, for example, that far from being a form of language that retards cognitive development, Black English enables types of academic work that could be done no other way, by Geneva Smitherman, Bell Hooks, and Carmen Kinner, to name only a few. Here we see gender, race, and class inequities being addressed in even more profound ways, ways that show why they need to be addressed, not only to serve overarching norms of social justice, but also to benefit humankind in direct, practical ways, by enriching the academic disciplines in their research quests. Saving the world? Not quite. Improving it? I'd say so. Now, I do realize that in all this, I'm painting with a very broad brush. I haven't presented any empirical evidence for the improved student success that I claim these decades of composition research have enabled. But by introducing the topic of saving the world, Fish has encouraged me to take a broad view, to do what our colleagues across the Quad call big history. Moreover, I feel confident that people who have regularly taught first-year writing over the last 20 or 30 years, there's a few in this room, will attest that we know more now than we did then about how to do it, and we're serving an ever more diverse student body with success. Not enough success, of course, never enough, but progress has been made. Well, now wait a minute, couldn't I provide some empirical data for this last claim at least? Have college graduation rates improved over the last 30 years, especially for members from the various marginalized groups I've been discussing? Such data actually could be provided. I think at my own school the curve has gone waveringly upward, but these data's value as evidence is questionable because there are many, many variables that influence academic success. At least we can say that both the student body and the professoriate have become more diverse in terms of race, gender, and sexual orientation over the last 20 to 30 years, and even Fish admits this. Presumably, people would not come to the academy and stay in the academy if they did not like it or could not make a go of it. So there's some perhaps anecdotal evidence that we've had success. But it's in fact the issue of how we measure success that I want to take up in discussing Fish's new book. And so now I'm going to move to the second part of the essay and the sort of my sort of poignard that I hope to stick him with is this question of what sort of evaluation of teaching he expects. But we'll get there in a minute. Okay. Fish's thesis in Save the World on Your Own Time is that academics have one job and one job only, to teach the material of their disciplines, the disciplinary methods, and objects of study. And I'm now going to spend a couple of pages just kind of summarizing for you what he's up to in this book. The goal of this teaching is to help students learn how to arrive at the truth about the objects of study. Truth-seeking is the academic activity of highest value, and the only other values that may be taught are in its service, such as the condemnation of plagiarism. In advancing this value of truth-seeking, Fish does not have to recant his anti-foundationalist principles. You might have been surprised to hear, if you know his work, that he's advocating the search for truth. He doesn't have to recant his anti-foundationalist principles because he says, quote, "You can be persuaded by postmodern arguments on the very general level of their usual assertion. Everything is mediated, everything comes to us under a description, the stipulation of fact is always perspective specific, and you can still hold firmly to judgments of truth, accuracy, correctness, and error as they are made in the precincts of some particular realm of inquiry," end quote. Indeed, Fish argues that discipline-based truths merit the term objective, even though not measured against any universal transcendent standard of value, because they are measured against the standards set by, quote, "tried and true procedures and protocols of a well-developed practice or discipline," end quote. Fish believes that if academics would heed his call, they would be in a much better position to defend themselves from those who would like to do their jobs for them. Fend off these attacks, Fish asserts. Don't let right-wing agitators argue that the academy needs to include professors from the greatest possible number of political positions in the interest of fairness. Professors' political views, says Fish, are completely irrelevant to their ability to teach their discipline if all they are teaching are their disciplines, as he argues. And hence there's nothing unfair about the current situation in which the great majority of the professoriate is politically liberal. Furthermore, he says, don't let right-wing agitators claim that minority views such as Holocaust denial or intelligent design need to be represented in the curriculum so as to serve the liberal value of teaching the conflicts. There are plenty of conflicts among legitimate, respected scholars to teach if one wants students to learn how academic argument is conducted. There is no need at all to represent arguments without academic disciplinary validity. Remember, Fish prepared for this line of defense by establishing that what academics do is search for truth. It may be only a certain kind of truth, but it's sturdy enough to judge Holocaust denial and intelligent design as intellectually disreputable. Above all, says Fish, don't let parents or legislators or other kibitzers tell you how academia should be run or demand from you practical justifications for the money required to run it. I feel sure that this whole argument evolved from his stint as dean in Illinois. Universities should not be run like corporations because universities are devoted to seeking truth, not making money, or doing anything else of immediate social benefit. Again, it will be seen how Fish has prepared for a particular argument by starting from the premise that what academics properly do is seek truth. Because we can't know which of our quests for truth will produce practical benefits for society, such as technological or medical advances, and because, according to Fish, we can't know whether our teaching will accidentally, as a byproduct, make some students better people or better citizens, we should not offer such outcomes as justifications for the academy, but rather simply say we do what we do for the pleasure of the search for truth and tell outsiders who attack us that they simply don't know enough about what we do to be legitimate critics. In doing their job of discipline-based truth-seeking, Fish argues, academics also are not to try to do someone else's job. And he regards as someone else's job both the character-forming activities that have traditionally been part of liberal education and the progressive political agendas of contemporary leftist academics. You are not to try to make your students better people or better citizens or help them with profound life choices. Just teach rhetoric or literary criticism or chemistry or economics. It is not for you to say what changes in attitude or behavior would in fact make your students better people or more responsible citizens. That's what Fish says. And those who are unwilling to give up character formation or political enlightenment as goals of teaching are sorted by Fish into 3 categories of error. Category number 1 he calls the network mistake. This is the argument that everything that happens in the academy is always already political, including what goes on in the classroom, because the academy is immersed in the larger socio-political network of our nation and our world. Fish's answer to this objection is that while academia is indeed immersed in a larger system, it has its own distinct functions within that system. He uses the metaphor of different parts of the human body. And the function of academe, as he reiterates, is to seek discipline-based truth. There is no need to attend to any larger political ramifications. You may, however, make politics the object of your disciplinary study. Fish calls this process the academization of contemporary social and political issues. Studying an issue is not the same as devoting class time to attempting to persuade students to take a particular position on it. As an example of academization, Fish mentions that he analyzed a speech by John Kerry in one of his classes and pointed out its many flaws in reasoning, even though a few weeks later he voted for Kerry. A second category of error, Fish dubs the objection of unworthiness. This is the view that, quote, even if it is possible to set aside one's political convictions when conducting a class, it would be unworthy to do so because it would be a dereliction of one's duty as a human being concerned with the well-being of the world, end quote. Fish's answer to this objection is contained in the title of his book. Save the world on your own time, be as politically active as you like after class hours, but keep out of the classroom everything but what is specific to your discipline and its methodical search for truth. A third category of error, there were 3, this is the third, Fish calls the objection of impossibility. In one form, this argument claims that politics must enter the classroom because the course material itself is political, for example, in classes dealing with law, government, political science, and so forth. Now, Fish's answer is that it is not the material that makes the class inappropriately political, but what is done with it. And as I've already mentioned, his solution to that is academize it. You can study political material, but you can't use it to promote or denigrate particular political views. However, now we're getting down to the real sort of moment of my engagement with Fish. Another form of this objection of impossibility error holds that it's impossible for academics to separate themselves from their own political, religious, moral, and ideological commitments when they enter the classroom. And so, therefore, these commitments must inform their teaching. Finally, Fish admits that an objection holds some water, that indeed such complete separation is impossible. He calls this the, quote, unavailability of purity. It's so classic that he would think of it in terms of purity, okay? But basically, his response to this position is that even if you can't completely separate yourself from your commitments, you should try to do so as much as you can when you are teaching. He considers that it is proper to do so. That's his word. And all this imagery of cleanliness here is so interesting. Just as, quote, proper behavior at the family dinner table differs from proper behavior at a corporate lunch, end quote. What you must do is compartmentalize. Okay, so that's Fish. Now, as I read Fish's arguments, I find that my response, rather than being resolute opposition, takes more the shape of yes, but. I agree with Fish that the principal task of academics is to teach the disciplines. And I completely agree with his understanding of the sort of truth that we seek. Indeed, I think I learned this view primarily from him. In the case of composition studies, I agree that the principal task is to teach writing. But as I have tried to show in the first section of this essay, the whole development of the modern field of composition studies has sprung from writing teachers' desire to do their jobs better, to find more effective ways of teaching the increasingly diverse student populations in our classrooms. I really have to wonder if Fish knows enough about the field of composition studies to make him a legitimate critic. We rhetoricians may perhaps have been subject to a form of Fish's objection of unworthiness, although I'd put it more in the form of a hope. I think many of us hoped that we would contribute to the well-being of the world through our work in the composition classroom, but that work had to focus on teaching writing. For this reason, one of the anthologies of provocative readings that Fish scorns, assembled by Bruce Herzberg and me, focuses on controversies that have already been decided. For example, slavery has been abolished. Class time in using this book, then, is not to be spent in encouraging students to discuss what they think about slavery. Rather, the focus is to be on the rhetorical strategies employed by the various players in the antebellum struggle to influence events. Moreover, our anthology contains pieces that represent a wide range of views. We made an effort to prevent each controversy we looked at from neatly sorting into two sides, and we included texts that advocate for positions that we find morally reprehensible, some of which are quite rhetorically skilled. Albert Bledsoe, for example, is a very able defender of slavery. Thus, I do advocate for what Fish calls the academization of composition classroom materials, and as he recommends, I even teach grammar. But I teach rhetoric as well, which requires analysis of text longer than a sentence. Indeed, by characterizing the field as composition studies only, he doesn't say composition and rhetoric, Fish leaves out a major part of what we do, addressing not only the structure of language, but also the rhetorical means of persuasion. From the description of Fish's writing class given in this book, I gather that I may do more that is proper to the teaching of writing than Fish does. I find more agreement with Fish, however, in what he has to say about fending off disreputable topics, such as intelligent design or Holocaust denial from academic curricula. But I'm less persuaded that we don't need to care about the diversity of the faculty along various axes of diversity. In fact, if you're already persuaded that we need to have a mix of genders, sexual orientations, races, social class origins, and more among college faculty, then you probably also should be concerned to have a mix of political views. This is where I really begin to part company with Fish. I think diversity among the faculty and among the students, too, is good, not only because it redresses morally reprehensible inequity, but because it enhances the intellectual atmosphere of academia. As I suggested above in connection with the diversification of academic discourses, new insights and new kinds of intellectual work are provided by a more diverse population participating in the discipline-based search for truth. So if it's true that the professoriate's largely liberal, that might be a problem. Maybe we should really try to diversify that a little bit more. Now, logically, Fish should disagree with me. He should say the political makeup of the professoriate is irrelevant, and logically, he should say that gender, race, class, etc., are just as irrelevant to the way academics do their job as their political, religious, or moral views. Even if people of different genders, races, social class backgrounds, etc., do have differences in their values, their experiences, these differences are irrelevant to the academic enterprise because no matter what their differences, all they will teach will be the academic discipline in which they've been trained, at least according to Fish. In other words, for Fish, the professor is a brain in a jar. And I can tell you that at this MLA panel, he pointed to this part of my critique of his book and he said, "She's absolutely right, that is what I think." Okay? This is not true to my own experience of the classroom. I believe that when my students encounter me as a writing teacher, they encounter all of me, my entire personality, informed by all my religious, political, moral, and social commitments. I firmly endorse that aspect of the objection of impossibility with which Fish himself agrees, namely that purity is impossible and I cannot divest myself of all these commitments when I enter the classroom. I also agree that I can and should behave properly, as he says, and not trumpet my convictions or blatantly reward those students who can convince me that they agree with me, but I believe that I can and do make my commitments known without becoming that exaggerated figure of fun, a character out of Dickens or Swift, who is the straw man Fish invokes in advocating the compartmentalization of one's commitments. I'm sorry, I keep interrupting myself, but I've been talking all day. How do I do that? Okay, first there's classroom conduct. What I'm telling my students about my own moral values and implicitly modeling for them by how I interact with them, how I word negative criticism of their work, even whether I come to class on time, and more. Then there's the category having to do with the course content. In planning my courses, I aim to engage students in the kinds of rhetorical analysis that are proper to my discipline, but from among the wide range of materials we could use to pursue these analyses, I choose texts and topics that reflect my commitments. We're not going to argue about whether slavery was right or wrong, for instance, but by choosing this topic, I make it known that I consider race relations to be an important topic. I imply that I don't think all racial problems have been solved in this country, and that's a political view. Moreover, while studying arguments made on various sides of that issue, I will undoubtedly let fall remarks that make it clear what I think about racial politics then and now. Indeed, if they were honest, I think all students will admit that they choose professors with whose personalities they want to come in contact, and avoid those they don't. And I think that's perfectly okay. What I'm talking about here are what Fish calls contingent effects. And now I'm going to quote him. Fish says, "I'm not saying that there's no connection at all between the successful practice of ethical, social, and political virtues and the courses of instruction listed in the college catalog. It's always possible that something you come across or something a teacher says may strike a chord that sets you on a life path you might not otherwise have chosen. But these are contingent effects. and as contingent effects, they cannot be designed and shouldn't be aimed at, end quote. I think this is exactly where we disagree. Fish admits that teaching can, in fact, have the kinds of consequences that he wants to put out of court. It can, quote, fashion moral character, or inculcate respect for others, or produce citizens of a certain temper, end quote. But it cannot do so with scientific predictability. So, therefore, he argues we should ignore the fact that it can do so at all. Note, by the way, that his principal objection to teaching for character formation does not seem to be that to do so is to tyrannize the students. He doesn't seem to have ethical objections to such teaching. Rather, he doesn't like it because he thinks it makes claims for benefits that cannot be scientifically substantiated, and so leaves academe open to all sorts of meddling criticism. But what kind of evidence for the efficacy of teaching to form values does Fish require? To be sure, there's not an instrumental relationship. I don't expect to be able to shape my students' characters so definitely that the results will be as visible as if I were molding a lump of clay. If I pour boiling water into the noodle cup, I'll get noodles, but I don't expect that degree of reassuring cause and effect in the classroom. And anyway, the noodles don't talk back. These so-called contingent effects of teaching are simply more ineffable than the effects of disciplinary training and harder to test for, although methods of doing so are being devised. For example, a rubric for examining students' moral development is being developed at St. Anselm College. So it seems to me Fish is really being scientistic here. But if I'm right, the teachers do have some kind of moral authority. What do I do with Fish's observation that excellent teachers can be absolutely terrible human beings and exemplary human beings can be terrible teachers? That's a quote. I'm afraid that here again we encounter Fish's besetting logical error, the straw man. I do not claim to be an exemplary human being, nor do I claim that this status is required for one to be worthy to teach. The main thrust of my argument is that whatever your personality, your students will experience it in some depth. But I will go further and say that I want to have around me colleagues whose values I respect, not just for my own comfort in department meetings, but because I believe that these values do leach out to students, and I care about my students and want the best for them. If you really are a terrible human being, you are not going to be able to completely compartmentalize that when you enter the classroom, and I believe it will ultimately harm your teaching, no matter how well you know your discipline. I've been puzzling for a long time over this problem concerning the ways the teacher's values come into play in the classroom. So now, in conclusion, those two words that every audience waits to hear, I'm going to do something that I find rather annoying when other scholars do it, namely quote extensively from my own earlier work. Here's a long passage from the afterword of my 1992 collection of essays, which I will read through a fishy lens while presenting it as additional evidence that Fish is far from the first to raise issues about what teachers can legitimately do in the classroom to promote values. So now I'm quoting myself. I can no longer feel that I'm doing enough to promote social justice simply by helping students to get an education, even if I specify a mission to teach students from groups that have suffered discrimination. Now, Fish would say this is evidence of committing the objection of unworthiness. You know what? I stand convicted. This explanation once satisfied me, and Fish says it should satisfy me now, when I could believe that I was giving no direct instruction in values in the classroom, but rather was simply offering students the value-neutral tool of academic discourse. I would have admitted perhaps to giving some indirect instruction in values, for example, by taking care to assign readings written by members of diverse social groups, but basically I could see myself as the objective scholar that Max Weber, and Fish, recommends as our role model. I saw my commitment to social justice being served more by the after effects or outcomes of my classroom work through the academic success of previously disenfranchised students, for example, than by the actual content of my interactions with students. That's the end of my self-quote. Okay, so it will be seen that here I summarize two of the ways in which I think composition studies can indeed contribute to making the world a better place. One, by doing our proper work of teaching writing, we help students develop abilities that will help them succeed in and beyond college, especially valuable for purposes of social redress if the students come from marginalized groups. Two, while we are doing this teaching, and to aid us in doing it, we can assign materials that raise issues of social justice and foster reflection on rhetorical methods of engaging them, as I suggested Bruce and I do in our anthology. But as implied in the self-quotation I've just given, these two ways of assuaging my sense of unworthiness didn't suffice for me then, and they don't suffice for me now. I found, as I explored my motives in the earlier essay, that, as I said, postmodern skepticism has taught me to see myself as viewing the world through an unremovable lens of beliefs and values shaped by the culture around me. Indeed, this was postmodern skepticism I learned mainly from Stanley Fish. The implications for my teaching that I drew then and still draw from this philosophical worldview are as follows. And again, forgive me for another lengthy self-quotation. I must see all of my classroom work as deeply imbued with my moral values. I certainly do not go into class and announce that we will now commence indoctrination into the following table of laws, yet everything I do in the classroom is informed by one or another element in my worldview, thus potentially conflicting at every turn with other elements in the students' diverse worldviews, and because of my institutional position at the head of the class, potentially undercutting their values. Service to my personal morality thus can no longer be seen as an after effect or outcome that's neatly separable from the classroom work. In other words, my morality can no longer be regarded as purely private and personal, as Weber and Fish would have it. My values take on an ethical dimension because I'm always trying to persuade my students to identify with them, whether I always realize I am doing this or not. And my values take on a political dimension because the differences in students' ability or willingness to respond to my persuasive pressure, differences that may affect their success in my classroom, whether I'm always aware of it or not, let's be honest, are differences that tend to spring more from their social group membership than from anything that could still be called personal idiosyncrasy. To disavow my moral agenda is simply to cover over my inevitable persuasive approaches. End quote. It will be seen that here I refer to the third way in which composition studies saves the world, a way shared with every other academic discipline, namely through contact with the professor's personality and values. On the one hand, I acknowledge that it's presumptuous of me to bring these values into the classroom, even though I can't help doing so. And also, by the way, even though I've never found students to be so biddable and easily manipulated as the agitators against so-called political correctness seem to think that they are. And it would be nice if they were that, but they're not. And on the other hand, like Fish, I believe that my values are right and true. I can't help but believe that. Why would I adhere to them otherwise? Therefore, I feel a little less guilty about dragging them after me wherever I go. And I do have one additional little solace, which is that I do change my mind in response to persuasion by others. Students as well as colleagues can lead me to see things differently, and I can bring witnesses to prove this. So an ideological tyrant I am not, but I hope a humble writing teacher who is helping her students to write better, to analyze various American rhetorics of persuasion, and to reflect, as every rhetorician must do, as Plato, Cicero, and Quintilian have warned us, to reflect on the moral, ethical, and political commitments entailed in wielding the tool or the weapon of words. If liberal arts education often can affect students' moral and political development positively, then I see no reason not to say so when asked to justify expenditures on higher education, just as I see no reason not to mention the practical innovations that sometimes issue from academic research. We do not have to promise such results in every case, every student enlightened, every laboratory, studio, and tome a beacon, in order to state fairly that good results are often achieved. I side with Fish in his rejection of the corporate model of management for academe, but I think we have a little bit more to offer in the way of a defense than, stand back, you're just too dim to understand what I'm doing, but I want you to pay for me to do it because I enjoy it. Which seems to be his main argument. Okay, so if there were, and I think if there were not larger potential benefits to be achieved, even if we know we won't achieve them every single time, I think even the most devoted specialist would become bored with what he or she was doing. The thrill would be gone, and I know Fish does not want that. Thank you. So the floor is open. Comments, questions, objections? Go ahead, Doug.
I'm wondering, what underlies Fish's concerns here, and just bracketing off, desire to always call attention to himself and his work. And I think all of us have that, so I'm cut him some slack. But is it, just as Reagan could always find the anecdotal welfare mom, the abuser.
Right.
I'm certain that Fish would have no trouble finding 3, 6, 47 anecdotal cases of the thing. But is it that we've done generally, we the profession, a bad PR job, that we don't have countervailing? Is this a lost rhetorical ground? After all, we don't have columns in the New York Times, he does, and so on. Sure. I just, I'm interested in the sort of well from which this comes.
Well, I mean, I think it's, there are several answers or several responses to that. I mean, I think it is true that the content of writing courses and the practice of teaching writing as it is typically done in American colleges is what you might call an occasion of sin. I mean, it's a situation that tempts you to do the kind of thing that Fish objects to. In other words, to make your class into a consciousness-raising session or a political, forum or a, personal problem, troubleshooting stuff, whatever. It's easy to go in that direction. It's a besetting problem, perhaps. And it may be one that we haven't adequately addressed. And I think we haven't adequately addressed it. We gave ourselves an out because we said, oh, well, we just want to talk about topics that the students are interested in, so they'll be interested to write about them, right? But that covers over the problem, which needs to be addressed more directly. So that's a problem. I think that's true. I also think that the problem I was talking about towards the end of the essay, well, how do you prove that teaching for personal development is effective? He's got us there, or he thinks he does, because there isn't very much that's out there that talks about rhetoric instruction as providing that kind of whole person development. Now, there is stuff that's in the works to do that. There's a lot of attention being paid in assessment right now to assessing personal development, moral development, character development, whatever you want to call it. I know of some of those efforts. I mentioned one in the paper. So there may be research forthcoming that will have more to point to, where he says, well, these are just contingent effects. You can't design for them. You can't predict them. We may never come up with the sort of empirical research he wants, but we may have some qualitative research that could better shield us from this charge. But then, as I said, I think Fish's argument that he's presenting right now is a very calculated, very politically calculated argument to deal. I really have to almost wonder how much of it he believes. Because his literary critical work, is anti-foundationalist. It's very imbued with a sense of how all of these contingent elements of the reader and writer influence the interpretive act. I mean, that's what he made his career on. So I really wasn't kidding when I said I think his time as a dean at a public institution, and also, not only that, but also he spent a lot of time in law schools in recent years. So discovering the kinds of arguments that will carry weight in non-academic public fora, I think he's been doing a lot of that. And this line of argument that he's making in this book, do your job, don't let anybody else do your job, and don't do anybody else's job. Those are his three principles. I think he's using those principles to erect a shield to protect the academy. And even though, as I say, in theory, which he said, I was reading him correctly, in theory, his position would seem to be an argument against affirmative action. Like it doesn't, the academy could be made up entirely of white men. It wouldn't make any difference at all. Entirely white male liberals or white male conservatives wouldn't make any difference at all in the delivery of instruction, according to the theory he expresses in this book. Even though that's what the theory says, he isn't going around attacking affirmative action programs. He's not attacking the trend in the academy to try to promote diversity. He's not saying he's against diversity. So I really wonder to what extent this is very much a kind of him giving himself the function of a public intellectual and creating an argument that other academics can use if they're only smart enough to realize it and not to just sort of flip out and panic because, he's killing some sacred cows. But of course, I couldn't allow him to say what he said about composition studies, so even though I agree with a lot of what he says, I had to go after him about that. Please.
One of the things that's interesting about what he's up to when he attacks composition studies is you would think he would know this, but he doesn't seem to really understand rhetoric.
Right.
Because you don't teach skills when you're teaching rhetoric.
Right.
You're teaching people to enter into a rhetorical situation and think about the ethical dimensions and pathetic appeals and so forth.
Right.
As you were talking earlier, it's very difficult to sort of make the rational argument separate from all of the other arguments that are involved, and yet to say, you ought to teach grammar.
Right.
It seems to be, and in some ways it does sound like Fish, because his read of rhetoric is so sophisticated.
Right.
And so, it's...
As far as the contemporary field is concerned, I think he found out about it once about 30 years ago.
Right.
And he figured that that was all he sort of needed to know, you know. He hasn't kept up. So he, you know, he...
I was Surprised by Sin, which is a
Right.
really amazing book.
Of course. Oh, he's a, you know, right. So the straw man composition studies that he creates, yeah, you know, it probably exists to this day, but it may have existed a lot more back 30 years ago when, you know, there's a lot more talk about authentic voice pedagogy and so forth and so on, students finding their own voice and blah, blah, blah. So he checked in once and then he just decided he knew enough. He knew all he needed to know about it. And he doesn't really, I think he really doesn't know much about what's going on in classrooms now. Please.
You mentioned Frere.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about one of his texts that comes after Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he kind of gives up on the idea that you can change politics via teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically says if you try to do that, you're going to get burned out.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the place where political transformation happens, it happens outside.
Mm-hmm.
But then what I understood you arguing is that a person's personality is part of what affects transformation in a political sense. Is that what you were arguing? And I'm not sure.
I think that's right. I think I would have to say yes. I think you have that right. My defense or my caveat for that summary of what I was saying is that my goals are very modest. I mean, Frere might have once upon a time thought that his type of literacy education was really going to result in Marxist revolution in South American countries. Well, that didn't happen, you know. But I think that on a more local level, his kind of literacy instruction did have social liberatory consequences, both in South America and also in Western Africa, where it was employed. So I think that empowering people to be more active on behalf of their own interests, if you have a form of education that can empower people to do that, it does have political consequences. And what was political in Frere's approach, Frere, in his pedagogy of the South American peasants, now you may know more about it than I do, so if you do, correct me, but he didn't tell them what the future should look like. He didn't tell them what society they should strive for. He just got them to see what was wrong with the society they were living in. The main thing he wanted to do was break through the cultural hegemony of the ruling class, if I could use a little jargon. That the people he was working with saw their situation as normal and natural and inevitable, and there's nothing that could be done about it. It's the way the world is. And what he wanted to get them to see was, no, it isn't the way the world is. It was created by people, and so it can be changed by people. But then you go out and change it as you see fit. He didn't prescribe what social measures should be taken. He was just trying to get the people he was working with to see that change could happen, and that they might have some tools that they could use to help make change happen. And, you know, probably, I mean, I don't know, but my guess is from what I know of him that probably contact with his personality was an important part of that, to feel that he cared about them in a profound way, and that he wanted to see them succeed, and that really, really mattered to him. And, you know, as I said in the paper, it's very tricky to me now to make analogies between his situation and the situation of American college writing teachers. So I again, want to hedge that around with caution. But I would still say that I can hope that my teaching, which includes all the things I mentioned, teaching grammar, reading these rhetorical texts, you know, having contact with my personality values, etc., all those things together, I hope do help some of my students to become more self-confident communicators, more empowered, better able to pursue what they see as their own interests, and first immediately in their education, and then, you know, as they go on in the world. What do we know about how much that happens? You know, we all have anecdotes of students who've come back to tell us. We don't have some of the research that I was just saying maybe we need, but my goals are modest in that regard, I think I would say. That, I don't know if that really answers your question.
It kind of just goes along with what he concludes in that sort of book that comes after.
Are you talking about education for critical consciousness?
But it's about
Yeah.
American students and trying to get away from this notion. And it goes along with what you were saying about getting away from indoctrination.
Yeah.
But also, how much can you do?
Right.
I can't remember the phrase.
Well, I think and I haven't read Frere in a while, but the thing that I remember from him and that I take, that's most useful to me and maybe most useful to his students, is this idea that reality can be changed. And that if you know that, you're better prepared to cope with the present crisis, whatever it is. Or you understand if something is happening that isn't right, that you need to look for alternatives, you need to look for a theory that explains it, that having that perspective in your arsenal is helpful. Please.
I'm trying to figure out the differentiation between, showing someone what's wrong with the status quo and egalitarianism. It seems to me that he would believe that yes, you can be egalitarian, that is give technical skills to the widest possible, the most diverse body of students.
Right.
And that he has to be dedicated to some kind of critical pluralism, that is the ability to compartmentalize your own convictions and understand that they do not equal the truth, would be something that he'd want to be able to teach you to do also. But what he wouldn't argue is that you should show someone like Jar Jar Binks as a racist symbol. And I'm wondering, in a composition classroom,
Right.
when do you justify moving from egalitarianism, critical pluralism, into critical consciousness? And what kind of teaching techniques do you use to do that?
I think that's really, really hard to do. I mean, that's the question of the hour. I mean, let's all work on that, because I think that's exactly what we need to know.
Well, should we?
But I think, and I don't have an elaborate answer for you. My short answer is that I think it's absolutely crucial to that effort that you make it clear to your students that all views are acceptable. And that, if you think Jar Jar Binks is a racist characterization, you may even let them know that, but you have to make it absolutely clear that it's okay with you if some of them think he's just goofy and there's nothing offensive about him. For me, I keep referring to the anthology, Negotiating Difference. It was really, really important to include in that anthology a lot of pieces that I found repugnant to my own values. And I dare you to show me another composition reader that does that. I dare you. I don't think you'll find another one. Most composition readers, to the extent that they deal with social problems, they represent politically correct views of social problems. They don't represent Christian fundamentalist views. They don't represent racist or sexist views. They represent my views, only. And I think if you're going to try to really encourage students to, as you say, move from critical analysis to critical consciousness, it has to be really clear that you are there to facilitate them and not to just steer them all in one direction.
Well, I guess the question I'm asking is if you should. Because it seems to me that, I agree with everything you're saying, just to take Fish's side for a moment.
No, go ahead.
Is that he's okay with the egalitarian agenda, he's okay with the pluralist agenda, and even the way you describe the readers seem to me to be kind of limited by a commitment to pluralism. Right? I will show both sides. I will show that as repugnant because I can stare into the abyss. And when I do that, I can pull back and show you that I am capable of a higher order abstraction, which would be the discipline-specific truth. It seems like but he wouldn't want you to go any further than that. And so if you don't go any further than that, I'm wondering, do you really agree with him?
Well, I think, I'm sorry, finish your...
No, and then I guess on the other, I'll stop.
I mean, I think he does. I think he goes further than that. He doesn't say a lot about his composition pedagogy in this book, and most of what he foregrounds in describing his composition pedagogy is about teaching grammar and mechanics. I mean, that's what he focuses on. But occasionally he'll let fall a comment in connection with something else, where he's not officially talking about his composition pedagogy, but he'll talk about analyzing the speech by John Kerry. Well, if he's doing that, he's doing more than just teaching value-neutral skills. Although, for purposes of the argument he's making in this book, that's what he claims to be doing nothing but teaching value-neutral skills.
It doesn't sound like he acknowledges his pluralism. I guess the book that I'd want to read side by side is Ellen Rooney's Seductive Reason, which is this attack against pluralism within Chicago School and arguing that itself is a politics. It is the ability
Oh, sure.
to compartmentalize your belief, the ability to, again, make these distinctions and judgments. He's really a liberal. He's defending liberalism as it's being value neutral and as an expression of the truth. So it seems like he's doing it, but I don't know.
Well, actually, picking up on
Go.
I haven't read the book of Fisher's. We're talking about like reading the blog and so on, and that you may recall, I think it was about a year ago, he was took up a kind of a similar theme, and the question was whether or not you could defend the enterprise of the academy in general by saying it promotes sort of liberal values, right? That by having this kind of intellectual pluralism and the free market ideas and so on and so forth, that inculcates in you a kind of habit of thought that is civically
Efficacious.
yes, which is what you're saying here. He says, not necessarily that it doesn't, but as you were saying earlier, you can't show that it does. And you don't want to make the argument that it does. Okay? You don't, in other words, you don't want to have the value of your work dependent on its capacity to make that happen. And the argument that he advances is that, well, no matter how we would try to then fill in what that actually means and what counts as good democratic sort of attitude towards the world, as soon as you try to particularize it, we'll all disagree. And we'll all be able to provide examples of people who we think of as being terrible Democrats, let's say, but who are very well educated, right? So that if I'm a very kind of libertarian, right-wing sort of person, I can't deny that Trotsky had a terrific education, nor if you're a Trotsky, I can't deny that Milton Friedman had a terrific education, right? So that the capacity to think critically is not guaranteed to result in any particular value system. So one way to try, it seems to me, not go further from that, but to retreat from that is to do what Fish talks about when he describes his own first-year classroom, which, and actually it sounds like a really kind of imaginative class, and there's things about it that I find very appealing, but what he does is to say, to the students, I want you to just invent a language. You don't have a language, you have to invent one. Create your own vocabulary, create your own rules of grammar. So in other words, it's an exercise in pure form, right? That is removed from any other considerations to the extent that you can use that word purify form. But it seems to be another question that we might ask here, I'm curious about it. So if we want to think about what we're doing as having consequences rather than retreating from them, how can we talk about that in a way that is not intentionally or otherwise self-serving? In other words, saying, well, here are some ways in which I think
Right.
isn't that great then? But no, he's saying that I think a great example is great and sort of cliche. Hitler and Wittgenstein went to middle school.
Yeah.
There was somebody, I don't know what kind of writing instruction he got in the world at that point in time, but somewhere, in theory,
It went wrong. It went terribly wrong, yeah.
who's going, I was a full-blooded Nazi who said, my God, I can't believe I created this liberal Jewish philosopher. Or who was a person of a rather different political spectrum who said, my God, I created the writer of Mein Kampf, right? So the consequences of this person's action are rather difficult to measure, but might stand as a kind of synecdoche for all of us. So I'm wondering, is there a way to talk about consequences that doesn't, that isn't, well, here are some ways in which I may have saved the world, but more in ways in which you may have condemned it, or damned it to hell, or something like that. How do you take the, rather than like Fish, sort of retreating, moving forward consequence? If you have any thoughts.
I'd love to have an answer to that question. To some extent, I tried to answer that question in this essay. So take it or leave it, in a way. If it doesn't satisfy you, this is the best I can do. As I said before, I think we don't have some of the qualitative research that might enable us to talk about consequences. My point about composition studies was a fairly specific point that people intended to try to serve better students of color, women students, students who don't speak English as a native language. There was an intention to do better by those students, that scholarship was produced that aimed to do better by those students, and that I think we are doing better by those students. And that some of the things that Fish objects to in composition studies are things that happen because of that agenda, which I'm willing to defend on intellectual grounds as well as social justice grounds. You know, I am not inclined to engage in the question of, well, you know, how could someone who's liberally educated become a Nazi? You know, how could someone who's a Christian become a Nazi? You know, I mean, do we have any system of discipline or personal development that turns out good people every single time? I don't think so. If there is one, please show it to me. I'll sign up. You know, as I say, my goals are much more modest than that. But what I can say is that I believe that I am having an impact on my students by everything that I bring to the classroom. And I think that that's okay. I don't think I have to be stopped from doing that or warned from doing that. And, you know, for purposes of this paper, I just, you know, like, I really wasn't kidding, and as I often am willing to do, is just make myself a target to shoot at. For heaven's sake, I'm crossing swords with Stanley Fish. How stupid do you have to be, you know? And my title is Composition Studies Saves the World, you know? So yeah, sure, of course that's self-serving and tangentious. I know that. But I wanted, you know, let's see if an argument can be made on this side of the question. And, you know, I think as long as I'm careful about what I assert, that I can make the argument. And in fact, I think Fish agrees with me more than he's willing to admit. I can't believe he's still married to Jane Tompkins, and he thinks it doesn't matter that women are in the academy. We don't need you. We don't need you, Jane. We don't need your work on sentimental novels. We really don't need that. I don't think he believes that. Please, Shannon.
When you're talking about the qualitative kind of research that you mentioned that's happening, what academic disciplines are picking up?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
What academic disciplines are picking up that qualitative research that you're talking about earlier?
Well, the reason I happen to know about it is because I teach at a Catholic school, and many schools with religious affiliations have become interested in knowing whether they are actually inculcating the religious values that they claim that they adhere to, right? Are we actually doing that? Are we forming, you know, character? So it's really religious colleges that are pioneering this effort to try to come up with assessment measures. And as far as I am aware of them, they are interdisciplinary, but they use sort of ethnographic types of studies. The St. Anselm one, if I'm remembering correctly, I think the St. Anselm one actually uses Perry's scheme of moral intellectual development in the college years, which is still pretty well respected as far as I know. And they have a rubric that they present to students and have them respond to a question that presents a challenge as first-year students, and then have them retested as seniors and see, you know, where they fall here in Perry's scheme as first years and here. I mean, again, you know, there's so many things involved in the changes that happen to people. Even if those changes happen while they're with us for 4 years, how do we know they happen because they were with us for 4 years? So the testing this kind of thing is very, very difficult. We're talking about something ineffable. But that's the kind of thing people are working on. Or longitudinal studies where you follow groups of students through all 4 years and see what turns up. I mean, Elizabeth Cesare Strader did a longitudinal study of a couple of college students long, long ago that I thought showed some of this. You remember the name of that book, Doug? You know what I'm talking about. So there have been attempts. Marilyn Sternglass, Time to Know Them. There's another one.
And Shannon, we're in the third year of a longitudinal study of 75 BU students. And one of the things, I mean, it'd be interesting to know from the artifacts we've collected what kinds of markers you would look for in their writing that would show evidence of the kinds of development.
Right.
I think it'd be tricky to damn near impossible to do that. It wasn't set up with that intention, but there at least is a vehicle for a relatively
I mean, I think this stuff is all sort of coming on the table right now because of cultural diversity. You know, if you're you know, educating the boys at Eton in some mythical past time when Britain was, you know, ruled the world and there wasn't really much question about British ideology, we all believe in it and we all don't question it, then questions like this don't arise. Of course you're expected as a master at Eton to inculcate the proper values of, you know, those who are destined to rule. And, you know, what's the problem? And that's what you're supposed to do, you know.
But, yeah, when you talk, it makes me think of, you know, composition and Redrick's history of trying to save the world. Even going back to Papillion, the proper upbringing of boys, and you Blair and the poor Scottish boys that he was going to, bring up. And I don't think biologists think, oh, we're going to change the world with the good values we're going to teach her.
And I'm terrified if these measures come into place. I'm very bad at making better citizens. So if this becomes part of my annual review,
It could be a problem. Right. Well, I mean, I think, that's exactly the sort of thing that Fish is concerned about in this argument. He doesn't want you to be surveilled, if I can coin a verb, in that way, especially by people who are outside the academy.
yeah.
Right? So that's why I say he's erecting a shield here to protect you from that. So you should thank him.
Let us, on a note there, adjourn to refreshments and thank Patricia.
Thank you.
Thank you.